Welcome back, Deep Divers. Today we're going to jump right into something really interesting, some high-level talks between the U.S. and Russia. But get this, the meeting was actually set up by Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, having Saudi Arabia as the host, offering that neutral territory sends a pretty strong signal, don't you think?
Definitely, like they all wanted to say, hey, this is different, especially with who was there, We're talking about Sergey Lavrov from Russia.
Right, and from the U.S. side, we've got Marco Rubio.
Secretary of State Rubio under the Trump administration. Okay, that's a pairing I wouldn't have seen coming. So with all that's going on, especially with Ukraine, what's the big deal about this meeting?
Well, you got to look back a bit. U.S. and Russia haven't exactly been best buds, historically speaking. So this meeting, it's not something you see every day. Maybe, just maybe, it means one side is ready for a fresh start.
Okay, let's get down to brass tacks. What actually came out of this whole thing, one thing that Lavrov kept saying that really stood out, is this idea of both sides just going after their own national interests.
Yeah, he was pretty upfront about that, wasn't he? It might sound like basic diplomacy, but it actually means a lot here. Russia is basically laying down the ground rules. They're saying, we're doing what we think is best for us, and you guys, you do the same.
So no more pretending we're the good guys.
Exactly. No moral high ground, no trying to force values on others.
It's like saying, let's be real, work with what each country actually needs. But doesn't that make finding common ground even harder?
Oh, for sure, it adds another layer to it all. But here's the thing. Right alongside of that national interest idea, Lavrov kept talking about Russia's, and I'm quoting here, maximum treaty-making ability.
Interesting. So what, they're ready to bargain?
That's what it sounds like. He's basically saying, we're ready to make deals, find solutions, even if we're starting from different places.
That's not what I was expecting. It almost sounds like they're really ready to talk. But let's be honest, haven't we heard this kind of talk before? How do we know this isn't just, empty words?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Talk is cheap, as they say. This is where actions matter more than words. One concrete thing that came out of these talks was the agreement to get ambassadors back in both countries and fast.
Oh, right. That whole ambassador thing has been stalled for ages. So getting them back in place, that's a pretty big step, right? Means they're getting those diplomatic channels back to normal.
Exactly. It's a concrete sign that things are moving towards normal relations. It shows they're ready to re-engage, have those direct lines of communication open again. Remember all that mess with visas and seizing property? It was a huge roadblock. Seems like Russia's ready to move past that.
And it wasn't all about the big picture stuff either. Lavrov even mentioned needing to sort out things like bank transfers between the two countries.
Yeah, that little detail actually tells us a lot. They're not just interested in making a good impression. They're willing to deal with the nuts and bolts, the stuff that affects people and businesses every day. That, combined with that treaty-making phrase, well, it makes me think they're really serious about making things happen.
Okay, so Russia seems to really want to get on better terms with the U.S., but let's be real. We can't talk about all this and ignore the big elephant in the room, right? Ukraine. Did they make any progress on that?
Well, they did agree to set up a process for dealing with the conflict, with a promise to have regular talks.
Okay, so more talking. But is that really progress? I mean, they've been talking for years and things haven't really gotten better, have they?
You're right to be skeptical, and it's smart not to get our hopes up too much. But there are a couple of things that make this agreement a bit more promising. First, Lavrov confirmed both the U.S. and Russia will be picking specific people to handle this dialogue.
So dedicated points of contact just for this. That's got to be a good sign, right? At least it shows they're taking it seriously enough to have people focus just on this.
Exactly. And there's something even more important. Lavrov actually mentioned that President Putin himself is willing to be involved in this process.
Wow, so this isn't just low-level stuff. It's coming straight from the top.
Looks like it. And remember when Lavrov was asked about that so-called three-point plan going around in the news? He totally shut it down, called it fake news. Makes me think they're ready for a clean slate, but on their terms.
That's a lot to process. It seems like Russia's really changed its tune. But how do we know this isn't just some kind of tactic, a way to buy time or shift the blame? What do you think?
That's the big question, right? It's hard to know what's really going on in someone's head, especially in diplomacy and especially with someone like Lavrov. But let's think about this. Russia's not exactly in a great spot right now. Those sanctions are hitting hard. The war in Ukraine is draining resources. And their image, well, let's just say it could use some work.
Yeah, they're feeling the pressure. So maybe all this talk about diplomacy, is it just a way to get out from under all that, ease up on the sanctions maybe?
Could be, but remember Lavrov saying they want to deal with bigger geopolitical problems and economic barriers? He even specifically mentioned the head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund being part of these talks. So maybe they're not just trying to escape a bad situation. Maybe they actually see a way forward, especially economically.
So they might actually see this as a chance to reset things with the U.S. and come out ahead.
It's worth considering. But a lot depends on how the U.S. reacts. If they see this as a real opportunity, they could make some deals that would benefit both sides, like in trade and investment.
That makes sense, but there's still the whole Ukraine situation. Can we really talk about cooperating on the economy when there's a war going on? And what about Lavrov saying they need to restrain Ukraine's leadership? Doesn't sound very peaceful.
Those comments were definitely a little worrying. We got to be careful about how we understand them. Maybe Lavrov was just trying to look tough, show that Russia still have power and influence, but it could also be a real concern for them.
What do you mean?
Think about it from Russia's side. They see NATO getting closer and closer. They see Ukraine maybe joining NATO, and they see all this military aid coming from the West into Ukraine. It makes them feel threatened. They want to make sure Ukraine doesn't become a base for what they see as Western aggression.
So basically they're saying we need Ukraine to stay neutral or at least not be against us. But how do you restrain a country's leaders? That doesn't sound very diplomatic at all.
Yeah, it does make you question how they're going about this. And it shows the biggest problem here. Everybody's got their own story. Each side thinks they're right. Each side doesn't trust the other's intentions. And each side has their own fears. That's the real gap they need to bridge.
So it's not just about treaties and ambassadors. It's about actually changing how people think about each other.
You got it. Diplomacy isn't just politics. It's about psychology, too. You got to understand why the other side is doing, what they're afraid of, what they want to achieve. It's about figuring out how to deal with their worries without making yourself less safe.
Right, that makes sense. Going back to the talks, though, there was something I found really interesting. Lavrov was asked about that three-point plan for Ukraine that's been in the news, and he just denied it, flat out said it was fake news. What's that about?
Good point. It shows how tough diplomacy is now with all this information warfare going on. There's so much noise out there, so much fake news and propaganda. It's really hard to know what's real.
So maybe Lavrov was actually hiding a real plan. Maybe they're just keeping their cards close to their chest.
It's possible, and it shows how important it is to think critically, to question what we hear, and to be careful about information coming from biased sources.
So we can't just believe everything we hear, even if it's from someone high up.
Exactly. We got to think about who's saying it, why they might be saying it, and what their agenda might be. And we got to be open to different interpretations.
It's like walking through a minefield. You got to be really careful where you step.
Exactly. And that's why these talks are so important. They're like a first step away from that minefield. It shows they're at least willing to try a different path.
But even if they do make some agreements, it still seems like there's a long and tricky road ahead. What should we be watching for in the next few weeks and months? What are the key things that will tell us how this is all going to go?
Well, one big thing is what happens after these talks. Does the U.S. pick that representative for the Ukraine discussions? Does Russia actually show up for those meetings? Do they follow through on the ambassador thing and actually fix those practical problems Lavrov mentioned? Actions speak louder than words, you know.
So it's all about what they actually do, not just what they say.
Exactly. Another thing to watch is how Russia talks about things from now on. Do they keep talking about dialogue and diplomacy, or do they go back to being aggressive and confrontational?
So the tone matters, not just the actions.
Right, and we can't forget about the big picture, what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, what's going on in Russia's economy and politics, what's happening within the Russian leadership. All these things are going to affect how Russia acts.
It's like a giant puzzle with a million pieces.
It is, and that's why we shouldn't jump to conclusions and we should be open to different possibilities.
So lots of uncertainties still.
For now, yes, but that's how it is when you're dealing with something this complicated, and it's exactly why these talks are so important, even with all the ambiguity and the challenges. It's a chance for them to talk, to explore different options, and maybe even find a way out of this mess.
The sliver of hope, even if it's just a tiny one.
I couldn't agree more.
Speaking of hope, Lavrov also talked about moving past all this confrontation and creating a more cooperative relationship between Russia and the U.S. What do you think? Is that even possible?
That's a big ask, a real call for a major change in how the U.S. and Russia deal with each other. And it's something a lot of people on both sides have been wanting for a long time.
Yeah, but is it realistic? They've got so much history, so much mistrust. Can they really just forget all that and start over?
It's definitely a tough challenge, but we got to remember that countries aren't stuck in time. Relationships can change, and even the worst enemies can find ways to work together when it's in their best interest.
So you're saying even with all that baggage, there's still a chance for a better relationship?
I think so, but it's going to take a lot of effort from both sides, a lot of goodwill, and a lot of political courage.
What would that look like? What could they actually do to build a more cooperative relationship?
Well, I think it all starts with communication. Both sides have to be willing to talk, to actually listen to each other's concerns and try to understand where the other's coming from.
So more dialogue, more diplomacy.
Exactly. And it's not just about leaders talking, it's about people from both countries connecting, cultural exchanges, academic partnerships, that kind of thing. The more we understand each other, the less we'll see each other as the enemy.
That makes sense. But what they all the things that really divide them, Ukraine, NATO, human rights, how do they overcome those differences?
Those are the tough ones, and there are no easy answers. But I think the key is to start with the things they do agree on, even if it's just a small area. Maybe it's fighting terrorism, or preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, or dealing with climate change.
So start small, build some trust, and then tackle the bigger issues.
That's the idea. It's a long process, and it takes patience and persistence.
It sounds like Lavrov's setting a pretty ambitious goal.
He is. And we don't know yet if the U.S. is willing to meet them halfway, but I think it's a conversation worth having.
These talks have definitely given us a lot to think about.
They have, and they've brought some much-needed reality to the whole discussion about the U.S. and Russia.
How so?
For too long, it's been this extreme back and forth. One side saying Russia's this huge threat that we got to fight. The other side saying Russia's just misunderstood and we should be friends.
You're saying both sides are oversimplifying things?
I think so. The truth is much more complicated. Russia's a complicated country with complicated goals, and their relationship with the U.S. is a mix of good and bad.
So what's the way forward then?
We got to accept that there's no easy fix. It's going to take time, patience, and a lot of hard work to build a more stable and predictable relationship with Russia.
So what should we be looking for to see if this is real progress or not?
The most important thing is actions, not words. Does Russia do what they said they would? Does the U.S. respond in kind? Do we see actual changes in Ukraine? Those are the things that will tell us if this is real or just a show.
So cautious optimism, but with a dose of reality.
Exactly. Diplomacy takes time, it takes patience, and it takes a commitment to keep talking, even when it's hard.
Well said. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Lavrov brought up something else that's really important, the attacks on energy infrastructure.
That's a big deal, especially with those recent attacks in both Russia and Ukraine. It's made things even more tense, and there's worry about things escalating.
He seemed to be saying that these attacks are making things worse, just adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah, he really stressed how important it is to protect civilian infrastructure and avoid hurting innocent people. That's a basic rule in international law, and everyone needs to follow it.
The problem is, it's not always clear who's doing the attacking. Both sides are blaming each other for hitting civilian targets.
True. And that's one of the hardest things about this conflict. There's a lot of confusion, and it's hard to figure out who did what.
So how do we figure out what really happened?
Independent investigations are key. Gather evidence, talk to witnesses, try to piece together the story.
But that's got to be tough in a war zone.
Oh, for sure. But we gotta try. It's about accountability. Whoever's doing these attacks needs to be held responsible.
So what can they do to stop these attacks from happening again?
Well, it starts with talking to each other. Both sides need to be open about their concerns and agree on some ground rules. Like, maybe they could agree not to target civilian infrastructure, or maybe they could set up safe zones around important energy facilities.
But for that to work, they need to trust each other. And right now, there's not a lot of that going around.
You're right, but that's why these talks are so important. They're a chance to start building that trust again.
Okay, back to something we talked about earlier, and this one's a tough one. Lavrov's comment about restraining Ukrainian leadership, what did he really mean by that? Was he just trying to sound tough, or is there more to it? What could this mean going forward?
Yeah, this one's tricky. Gotta be careful here. We're dealing with a lot of vagueness, and Lavrov's really good at using language in different ways. On the surface, it sounds like a threat, telling Ukraine to fall in line.
Yeah, that's how a lot of people are seeing it. But you're saying there might be other ways to look at it.
Definitely. Maybe Lavrov was trying to show the U.S. that Russia has power over Ukraine, that they can influence things there.
So it's like saying, we can help you solve this problem, but we can also make it worse.
Exactly. It's a classic move in diplomacy carrot and stick.
Okay, a power play. But what does Russia actually want? What would restraint look like for them?
That's the million-dollar question. Could be a lot of things. Maybe they want a different leader in Ukraine. Maybe they want Ukraine to have a weaker military. Maybe they want to stop Ukraine from joining NATO. Or maybe Lavrov was being vague on purpose, so everyone keeps guessing.
More questions than answers.
Oh, yeah. But that's diplomacy a lot of the time. It's like feeling a way around in the dark, trying to figure out what the other side really wants. And this is going to keep playing out for a while.
And we'll be here to help you make sense of it all.
You got it.
Okay, we've talked a lot about what Russia wants, but what about the U.S.? Is there a chance for real cooperation here, or is this all just a way for Russia to get what it wants?
That's the heart of the matter, isn't it? We've seen Russia talking about wanting normal relations, treaties, even practical things like sorting out bank transfers. But they're also being very clear about what they want, about restraining Ukraine, and about NATO being a no-go.
Like they're saying, we'll work with you, but only on our terms. Makes me wonder, is the U.S. even ready for that kind of conversation?
That's a great question, because remember, this isn't just about Russia. The U.S. has its own goals, its own allies, and its own political pressures back home. The Trump administration has to figure out how to respond to all this, and that's not easy.
Like a high-stakes poker game, where everyone's trying to read each other's minds. What do you think will be the most important things that determine how this plays out?
Well, Ukraine is obviously a big one. If the fighting gets worse, it's game over for any kind of deal. But if they can actually make some progress toward a ceasefire and a political solution, that could open the door for bigger U.S.-Russia talks.
So this whole diplomatic reset, if we can even call it that, depends on fixing the very conflict that's causing all the problems in the first place. That's a tough one.
It is, and we can't forget about politics within both countries. In the U.S., a lot of people don't trust Russia. And if the Trump administration looks like it's giving in too much, it could be bad for them politically. And in Russia, there are people who think any compromise with the West is a sign of weakness.
So even if both sides want to find common ground, they've got their own internal battles to fight.
Exactly. And then there's the rest of the world. How will other countries, especially in Europe, react to this? Will they support it, or will they feel like the U.S. is throwing them under the bus?
Sounds like there's a lot that could go wrong even if both the U.S. and Russia are serious about this.
That's the truth. Diplomacy is fragile, and one wrong move could ruin everything. But that doesn't mean we should lose hope. Even if this doesn't work out, they need to keep talking, because in the end, the only way to solve these problems is through dialogue, understanding, and finding common ground.
That's a good point. So for all of us trying to figure this out, what should we be paying attention to in the next few weeks and months? What are the key things to watch for?
Action's not just words. Does Russia actually follow through on their promises from these talks? Does the U.S. do the same? Do we see real changes happening in Ukraine? Those are the things that'll tell us if this is the real deal or this is a bunch of hot air.
So cautious optimism, but also keeping our feet on the ground.
Exactly. Diplomacy takes time, it takes patience, and it takes sticking with it even when it gets tough.
Well said. Okay, I want to switch gears for a minute. Lavrov said something else that really caught my attention. He talked about needing to deal with these attacks on energy infrastructure.
Yeah, that's a big deal, especially with all the recent attacks in both Russia and Ukraine. They've just added fuel to the fire, made things even more tense and dangerous.
It sounded like he was saying that these attacks aren't helping anyone, just making things worse.
He was really clear about that. He said it's crucial to protect civilian infrastructure and avoid harming innocent people. That's a core principle of international law that everyone needs to respect.
But the problem is, we don't always know who's responsible for these attacks. Both sides are accusing each other of targeting civilians.
That's true, and that's one of the toughest things about this conflict. There's so much confusion, it's hard to tell who's doing what.
So how do we get to the bottom of it? How do we figure out what's really going on?
Independent investigations are crucial. Gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, trying to piece together the puzzle.
But that must be incredibly difficult in a war zone.
It is, but it's essential. We need accountability. Those responsible for these attacks have to be held responsible.
So what can be done to prevent these attacks from happening again in the future?
It starts with dialogue, communication. Both sides need to be upfront about their concerns, their fears, and agree on some basic ground rules. Maybe agree to avoid targeting civilian infrastructure or establish safe zones around those key energy facilities.
But wouldn't that require a level of trust that's simply not there right now?
Absolutely. And that's why these talks are so important. They're an opportunity, a chance to rebuild that trust, however fragile it may be.
Okay, let's circle back to something we talked about earlier. I know it's a tough one, but it's important. Lavrov's comment about the need to restrain Ukraine's leadership. What did he actually mean by that? Was it just tough talk, or is there something more concrete behind it? What could be the implications of this statement?
Yeah, this is a tricky one. Gotta tread carefully here. Lavrov is a master of words, a seasoned diplomat. When he says something like restrain, it's worth paying attention to. We're dealing with a lot of ambiguity, a lot of room for interpretation. He knows how to use language to convey multiple meanings at once. On the surface, sure, it could be taken as a threat, a warning to Ukraine to toe the line.
And a lot of people are interpreting it that way, understandably. But are you saying there could be other interpretations, other ways to understand what he meant?
Absolutely. It's entirely possible that Lavrov was trying to signal something to the U.S. Maybe he's saying, look, we have leverage over Ukraine. We can influence what happens there.
So it's a way of saying, we can help you solve this, but we can also make it a whole lot worse.
Exactly. Classic carrot and stick diplomacy.
Okay, so it's a power play. But what is it that Russia ultimately wants? What would restraint look like in practice?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There are a lot of possibilities. Maybe they want to see a change in leadership in Ukraine, or limit their military capabilities, or prevent them from joining NATO. Or maybe, just maybe, Lavrov was intentionally being vague, leaving everyone to guess and speculate.
So we're left with more questions than answers. That's frustrating.
For now, yeah. But that's often the nature of diplomacy. It's a process of probing, testing, trying to figure out what the other side's bottom line is. And this process is going to continue to unfold in the coming weeks and months.
And we'll be here to help you make sense of it all as it develops.
Absolutely.
Well, it feels like we've covered a lot of ground today, a lot to think about.
We have, and there's still so much more to unpack.
So true. These talks have raised so many questions about the future of U.S.-Russia relations, about the conflict in Ukraine, about the whole geopolitical landscape. It's fascinating and a little bit overwhelming.
I couldn't agree more.
Before we move on to part 3 of this deep dive, I want to get your take on something else Lavrov said that really struck me. He talked about the need to understand and respect each other's national interests. It sounds simple, but is it really that easy?
It's a fundamental principle of diplomacy, but it's often easier said than done, especially when tensions are running high. It's easy to forget that the other side has its own legitimate concerns, its own priorities. We get caught up in our own perspective, and it's hard to step back and see things from their side.
So what does it mean to understand and respect Russia's national interests, especially in the current situation? It feels like we're talking about two completely different worlds.
I think it starts with acknowledging that for Russia, Ukraine is not just some random country. They see it as a crucial part of their sphere of influence. Centuries of history, cultural ties, economic ties. It's not something they're going to just let slip away, especially not into the Western sphere.
But Ukraine is a sovereign nation. They have the right to choose their own alliances. It's not up to Russia to decide their fate.
Absolutely, they have that right. But from Russia's point of view, NATO expansion is a direct threat to their security. They see it as a hostile act, and they're going to react accordingly. It's not about logic, it's about perception, about deep-seated fears.
So it's a clash of perspectives, a fundamental disagreement about how the world works. How do you bridge that kind of divide? It feels impossible.
It is a huge challenge, no doubt, but I think dialogue is the key. We have to be able to talk to each other, to genuinely listen to each other's anxieties and try to find ways to address them. It's not about agreeing necessarily, but about understanding.
But how do you address Russia's concerns without sacrificing Ukraine's right to make its own choices? It feels like a no-win situation.
It's a difficult balance, no doubt, and there are no easy solutions. But I think it starts with recognizing that there are limits to what NATO can realistically do.
What do you mean?
Realistically, Ukraine joining NATO anytime soon is unlikely. Russia is simply too opposed, and they have the military might to back that up. It's not about right or wrong, it's about the reality on the ground.
So what's the alternative? If NATO is off the table, what options does Ukraine have left?
I think the best path for Ukraine is to adopt a neutral stance, similar to countries like Finland or Austria, maintain their independence, but also reassure Russia that they're not a threat. It's a delicate balancing act.
But wouldn't that be a betrayal of the Ukrainian people? Many of them want to be part of the West. It feels like asking them to give up on their dreams.
It's a tough choice, a heartbreaking one with no easy answers, but I think it's the most realistic path, the one that offers the best chance for peace and stability in the long run.
So you're saying Ukraine needs to make concessions to appease Russia to prevent further conflict. It doesn't feel fair.
I think it's part of the equation, a painful but necessary part. But it can't just be Ukraine making concessions. The West also needs to be willing to compromise.
What kind of compromises are we talking about? What would the West need to give up?
I think the West needs to reconsider NATO expansion. They need to understand that pushing NATO right up to Russia's borders is seen as a provocation, a direct threat. It's not about whether it's actually a threat, it's about how Russia perceives it.
But NATO is a defensive alliance. It's not a threat to Russia. It's about protecting its members.
That's the Western perspective, the way we see it. But from Russia's point of view, it's a hostile force, an encroachment on their territory, their security. If we want to find a way out of this, we need to take their perspective seriously, even if we disagree with it.
So you're saying the West needs to be more understanding of Russia's position, even if we don't agree with it? That's a hard sell for a lot of people.
It is, but I think it's a necessary step if we want to avoid a larger conflict, a conflict that no one wants.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Lavrov also mentioned the potential for more cooperation between the U.S. and Russia on things like counter-terrorism and preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. Is that just talk, or could that actually happen?
I think it's a hopeful sign, a reminder that even with all the tension, the U.S. and Russia still have some things in common, some areas where they can work together.
It sounded like he was saying that if they can cooperate on those things, it could help build trust and maybe even improve relations in general. What do you think?
I agree. It's about finding common ground, a starting point for building bridges and working together. Even small steps can make a difference.
It's a good reminder that diplomacy isn't always about winning or losing. Sometimes both sides can benefit.
Exactly. And even when two countries are at odds, there are still opportunities to find common ground and work together for the common good.
So even though Lavrov just mentioned it briefly, this idea of cooperating on things like counterterrorism and nuclear non-proliferation, it could actually be a pretty big deal.
I think so. It shows they recognize that some issues are bigger than their rivalry, issues that require them to put aside their differences and work together.
And maybe, just maybe, it's a sign that even in these dark times, there's still hope for finding common ground and building a more peaceful and secure world.
Well said. I couldn't agree more.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have, but there's always more to explore.
So true. And that's what makes these talks so fascinating. They really make you think about the future of the U.S. and Russia, the conflict in Ukraine, and the bigger picture of global politics.
Absolutely. I'm glad we had this conversation.
Me too. Okay, before we jump into part 3 of this deep dive, I want to get your thoughts on something else Lavrov said. He talked about the importance of respecting international law and the UN Charter. It sounds like a given, but is it really that simple?
It's a fundamental principle, the bedrock of the international system. But in a world where international norms and institutions are under so much pressure, it's a point worth emphasizing, worth fighting for.
It seemed like he was saying that sticking to these principles is essential for maintaining order and stability, for preventing chaos in the world.
Exactly. He stressed that a rules-based international order is in everyone's interest. It provides a framework for resolving disputes peacefully and prevents the law of the jungle, the rule of the strong over the weak.
It's like having traffic laws, right? Everyone knows the rules of the road, and it makes it less likely we'll crash into each other.
Perfect analogy. It highlights how important it is for everyone to understand and agree on the rules that govern how countries interact with each other.
So even though Lavrov just mentioned this in passing, it's actually a big deal, especially in a world where these principles are constantly being challenged and ignored.
It is a big deal. It's a call for all countries to uphold their commitments, respect each other's sovereignty, and work together to maintain a stable and predictable international order. It's not easy, it's a constant struggle, but it's worth fighting for.
Absolutely, because ultimately, a world based on rules, on agreed-upon principles, is in everyone's best interest. It's the best foundation for peace, cooperation, and progress.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. But as always, there's more to explore.
I'm ready to keep digging.
Me too. Let's see where this journey takes us next.
I'm right there with you, navigating the twists and turns of diplomacy.
Okay, let's delve into something else Lavrov brought up that I found quite interesting. He talked about the need to address the issue of historical grievances and their impact on contemporary relations.
That's so crucial. History has a way of lingering, of shaping perceptions, breeding distrust, and making reconciliations so much harder.
It sounded like Lavrov was suggesting that it's not enough to just ignore these grievances. We need to acknowledge them, understand their impact, and find ways to address them constructively.
Exactly. He emphasized the need for empathy, for understanding, for a willingness to see the world through the other side's eyes. It's not about condoning past actions, but about understanding their lasting effects.
It's like trying to untangle a really complicated knot. You have to be patient, carefully work through each strand, each snag, to find a way to loosen it.
That's a great analogy. And it highlights the need for patience, persistence, and a willingness to have difficult conversations. It's not easy, but it's essential.
So even though it might seem like dwelling on the past, focusing on historical grievances is actually a critical step toward building a more stable and secure future.
Exactly. The past shapes the present, and unresolved grievances can fester, poisoning relationships and hindering progress.
And it's a reminder that true reconciliation requires a willingness to confront the past, to acknowledge wrongdoing, and to seek forgiveness. It's not about forgetting, but about understanding and moving forward together.
It's a difficult process, a painful one, but ultimately it's essential for healing old wounds and building a more peaceful and just world.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to step back and look at the bigger picture. We've seen this apparent shift in Russia's diplomatic approach, a shift towards wanting better relations, towards negotiation, towards finding solutions. But is it genuine? Is it just a tactic? What does it mean for the U.S. and for the world?
That's the question, isn't it? The question that's on everyone's mind. We've seen Russia signaling that they want things to go back to normal, that they're open to making treaties, even down to practical things like making bank transfers easier. But they're also being very clear about their own interests, about what they want, about restraining Ukraine, and about NATO being a hard no.
It's almost like they're saying, we're willing to work with you, but only on our terms. And it makes me wonder if the U.S. is even ready for that kind of conversation.
That's a crucial point. This isn't just about what Russia wants. The U.S. has its own interests, its own allies, and its own political pressures back home. The Trump administration has a tough decision to make. How do they respond to this?
It's a high-stakes poker game where each side is trying to read the other's hand, trying to figure out what their next move will be. What do you think will be the deciding factors in how this all plays out?
The situation in Ukraine is obviously going to be a major factor. If the conflict escalates, it's pretty much game over for any chance of a deal. But if there's real progress towards a ceasefire and a political solution, that could create the space for those broader U.S.-Russia talks to actually go somewhere.
So the success of this whole diplomatic reset, if we can even call it that, depends. So the success of this whole diplomatic reset, if we can even call it that, depends on fixing the very conflict that's causing all the problems in the first place. That's a tough one?
It is. It's a bit of a catch-22, and we can't forget about the political situations in both countries. In the U.S., a lot of people are really suspicious of Russia, and if the Trump administration looks like they're giving in too much, it could hurt them politically. And in Russia, you've got those hardliners who see any compromise with the West as a sign of weakness.
So even if both sides genuinely want to find common ground, they've got their own battles to fight at home.
Exactly. And then there's the rest of the world to consider. How will other countries, especially in Europe, react to this? Will they be on board, or will they feel like the U.S. is leaving them hanging?
It sounds like there are a lot of ways this whole thing could fall apart, even if both the U.S. and Russia are really committed to making it work.
That's the reality of it. Diplomacy is a delicate dance, and it wouldn't take much to mess it all up. But that doesn't mean we should give up hope. Even if this attempt at a reset doesn't work out, it's crucial to keep those lines of communication open. Because at the end of the day, the only way to solve these complicated problems is through dialogue, through understanding, and through a willingness to find common ground.
That's a really important point. So for everyone trying to wrap their heads around all of this, what should they be paying attention to in the coming weeks and months? What are the key things to watch for?
I'd say the most important thing is to focus on what they actually do, not just what they say. Does Russia follow through on the thing they agreed to in these talks? Does the U.S. do the same? Do we see real progress happening in Ukraine? Those are the things that will tell us if this diplomatic opening is the real deal or just smoke and mirrors.
So cautious optimism, but with a healthy dose of realism.
Exactly. Diplomacy is a long game. It takes time, it takes patience, and it takes a willingness to stay engaged, even when it's tough.
Well said. It's been a fascinating conversation and a lot to think about. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure. Always happy to talk about these complex issues.
And for all our listeners out there, we hope you found this deep dive informative and insightful. If you did, please subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.